Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on such a bitterly cold night. We appreciate it very much. My name is Madhavanti Ghosh, and I'm the Allstaff Associate Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan art here at the Art Institute. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you and wish you a very happy New Year. As we begin this program, please may I remind you to make sure that your devices are silenced. Thank you. This evening, we have gathered to hear about Thangkas, which are portable painted banners popular within Tibetan Buddhism, from Dr. Christina Anderson, the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Buddhism Public Scholar at the Art Institute. Kris specializes in Tibetan, Newar, and Indian Buddhism and holds a PhD in Buddhist studies from Berkeley. At the Art Institute, she is documenting and studying the Tibetan Thangka and Nepalese Pobha in the Arts of Asia collection. She has previously studied some of the Thangka in the Field Museum's collection as a Boone Scholar intern during her undergrad years at Northwestern, when she also worked on Tibetan contemporary art. Her doctoral research focused on Buddhist tantric funerary rituals in Tibet and Nepal. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Kris Anderson, and she joins me on the stage to present Thangkas Unrolled, a look at Himalayan Buddhist art, Buddhist painting, sorry. Kris, over to you.
All right, can you all hear me well? Yes? Thank you all so much for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you tonight. Thank you for coming out on this rather chilly day. Maybe it's normal for this time of year, but after we had all that warm weather, it suddenly seems very cold. But we all made it here. So today I'm going to talk to you about Tibetan Thangkas. And when I was preparing this talk, I was kind of overwhelmed. I was wondering, well, how can I even begin? There's so much that I can say. And as so often is the case, I realized that sometimes the question, the problem, is the answer to the question. That is to say, the thing that I want you all maybe to take away from this tonight is the knowledge that there's so much more. I'm only going to be able to talk about a little of this and a little of that, but that just means there's a lot more for you to learn. So there will be things I don't manage to cover, but I'm going to try to talk about some of the stuff that I find really cool, and I hope you will too. So I'm going to start, perhaps obviously, perhaps not, with Tibet. Tibet is located in the middle of Asia. And in particular, we actually have to go back in time. We have to go back to the 8th, 9th century. This was the time period when the Tibetan Empire expanded and reached its greatest extent. At one point, it reached across a great part of Asia, as you can see here. And this is another map that is somewhat similar, but as you can see, it also shows the trade routes. And so from this, you can see how Tibet is right in the middle of everything, yeah? So sometimes it is said that Tibet is isolated or far from the world, but in fact, that was not the case. Tibet was very much connected to other places, to its neighbors throughout history. And one of the things that I'm hoping to show all of you is how the different kinds of Tibetan art, Tibetan Thangkas that we see, it's all influenced by their neighbors, by the contact with regions, with other cultures in the surrounding area. And this is the second part of what we have to start with, Buddhism. In particular, the origin of Buddhism in Tibet. This happened just before the 8th century, so this was all kind of coming together. The introduction of Buddhism to Tibet came, as with other Buddhism. Buddhism was founded in India a long time before it came to Tibet, actually. By the time it came to Tibet in the 7th century, it had already existed in India for 1,000 years. And as you can see, we have this origin in kind of the center here, and the blue-purple arrows show the journey of Buddhism as it went up to Tibet and then beyond. And here's a little bit of a closer view. Again, you can see the purple arrows showing the journey of Tibet, kind of going up from Buddhism going up from North India into Tibet. But what does it mean for Buddhism to move? Buddhism is a religion or a tradition or a lot of different things. How does it move? There are kind of 3 different things that we can talk about in this respect. One is people. Buddhism traveled in the form of people. People traveled back and forth. Sometimes this was monks traveling from India, going to Central Asia, going to China. Sometimes it was Central Asian monks going to India or Central Asian monks going to China. Sometimes it was Chinese monks making the reverse journey, going from China and traveling to India. That painting there is Xuanzang, who is a Chinese pilgrim who is very well known and important in the history of Buddhism because he actually left writings about his experiences when he visited India. The second kind of element here, Buddhism traveled in the form of objects and art, and we are here today to talk about art, so this one is of particular interest. I'll have a couple more specific stories in a minute, but just know all along the trade routes, there were people traveling, they were bringing different kinds of objects, ritual implements, art, and other things. And the other things in question, specifically texts. Buddhism relies on sacred texts as kind of the core of its doctrine. And these were transported in various languages along the trade routes as well. There's a lot of stories of Buddhist teachings, traditions reaching China, reaching Japan in the form of physical scrolls or pechas or whatever form of books was in that particular time and place. So the movement of texts is just as important as of people and objects. And then we also have some legendary accounts, and whether they are true or not, we don't know, but for both China and Tibet, actually. In the case of China, one of the legends of how Buddhism came to China is that the emperor had a dream, and in the dream he saw a golden figure or statue or Buddha, and he asked his advisors, "Who's that?" And they say, that's the Buddha from the West or the enlightened one. And so then from then there was effort made at the emperor's request to seek it out. There's another one for Tibet, which is that the kind of traditionally honored first Buddhist king of Tibet, Songtsen Gampo, took 2 wives. One was a Nepali queen and one was a Chinese queen. And each of them brought a Buddha image with them from their home country. At this time, both Nepal and China were already Buddhist, and so they were bringing Buddhism in with their kind of marriage. Buddhism in Tibet, so Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism. So I guess the first thing, I'm coming at this kind of from a strange angle, which is, again, geography. But Buddhism came to Tibet quite late, comparatively speaking, not until the 5th to 7th centuries. It's actually, as you can see here, there are, on the left side, a set of arrows going up this way and reaching here. Those ones happened much earlier. Those ones happened around the 1st century. And then it wasn't until later that we get this purple route going north. The reason for this, if you look at this map that includes the trade routes, it also shows some of the topography, although not really well enough to make it clear. But that big pale area where the Tibetan Empire is, part of that is the Tibetan Plateau, which is very high altitude, very inhospitable, very hard to travel across. And of course, at the bottom, between Tibet and India, you have the Himalayan mountains. Those are very hard to travel across as well. Even further, going north, the trade routes, you can see they go around this area. That's because that's the Taklamakan Desert, which is, again, a very hard place to travel. So around the 1st century, when Buddhism initially made its way out of India, it went further to the west. It had a much easier time traveling through the mountain passes, which is to say, the people had an easier time traveling through the mountain passes. And so one type of Buddhism, the type that was in India around the 1st century, that made its way to China very early. Come the 7th or so century, we have Buddhism coming to Tibet. But by that point, the Buddhism as it was practiced in India was very different. And so initially, the type of Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the reason it is different from the Buddhism in China to start with is because it was coming from a different starting point. It was coming from India 6 or 7 centuries later. As you can see, this is just kind of to show you how traveling directly through Tibet was kind of an obstacle. So those arrows point to the way it kind of was traveled around first. And then here again, coming back to this map once again, can you tell I like this map? The purple arrows we have here show then the direction that Tantric Buddhism went. So it went to Tibet, and then it passed on and was taken into Mongolia. It existed in China for a while, but Chinese Buddhism was already quite well established. So it had more success actually when it continued on to Japan. So talking about Vajrayana Buddhism and Tibet, so, you know, when there's a question, you're like, this is a really big topic, how can I cover it? And you have to be really careful or figure out what you're going to say. So I was trying to figure out, what can I talk about? How can I explain Tantric Buddhism? And I think there are many other ways I could say it, but it's based on the same philosophical concepts of Mahayana Buddhism, of the Buddhism that came before, but it considers some of the implications of them, and then it suggests or introduces a ritual technology that it promises can help you achieve enlightenment in one lifetime. In traditional Buddhism, the original idea is it takes hundreds of thousands of lifetimes of being a bodhisattva, being someone who practices good deeds and lives lifetimes and lifetimes improving their karma, and then finally becomes a Buddha. So this method promotes an idea, well, if you take this approach, you can achieve it in one lifetime. There's other ways to talk about it, and I'll kind of touch on them a little bit later. But what it means is it brought new texts, a new pantheon of deities, new art and iconographic practices, new rituals. For something to be tantric, what does that mean? It means, on one level, it means it is somewhat related to a tantric text or tantric practice. The tantras are a group of texts that teach these kind of practices. So then, what about a thangka? What's a thangka? As a physical object, Madhu already introduced that they are painted banners, and they have a particularly unique form. It's not just the painting. The banner is also equipped with a curtain, which can be lowered, and then sometimes they're not present, but often ribbons that hang down in front. Here we now are looking at some of the thangkas at the Art Institute. This is showing the process of unrolling one. As you can see here, they're, on the upper left is a set of 7. They're rolled up, and then going to the upper right, you can see beginning to unroll them. Going down to the lower left, you have, as it begins to get rolled out, the yellow that you see there, that's the curtain, which is covering and kind of, at this moment, concealing the thangka. And then in the lower right, you can see as we have the curtain rolled up, so you can see the actual painting. There's a particular way that the curtain is displayed. When it's rolled up properly, it turns into a kind of a flounce as you can display it. And it can be pulled down both for preserving the image and sometimes for ritual situations where the image is not supposed to be shown. One of the important things about it, and one of the things that, as you can tell, I like talking about geography, so I like talking about portability too. One of the really striking things is the opportunities that were made available by the fact that this form is so portable. As you can see here, this is a whole group of 7 of them, and they are in the Art Institute's collection and very well preserved, which comes in handy for some of the travel of Buddhism. In particular, we have this arrow here going from Tibet up to Mongolia, and this ties into something in the galleries right now. In the Alsdorf Galleries 140, there's Portable Treasures of Mongolia, and we have there a wooden shrine, promised gift of Barbara and David Kipper. And this is very similar in terms of the type of image to Thangkas. The Thangka on the left is not in the Art Institute's collection, but I'm showing it together to show you that despite these being very different in size, the right one is very small, and I encourage you to go take a look at it later on if you have a chance. You can see from just the shape of it, without even knowing what it is, that there's a lot of similarity there, yeah? What it is called a refuge field, and it is a diagram of all of the figures in a lineage of a particular school of Buddhism. In Buddhism, your lineage, the way that your teachings are traced back to the Buddha is very important. So an image that collects all of them, including Buddhas and other deities, protectors, human teachers, going all the way back. This is kind of an object of contemplation and veneration sometimes. An example to show you something that if you go look, you'll be able to pick out the details. So oftentimes, this particular kind especially is made in the form of a tree. All of the figures are kind of planted around the tree. And it's easiest to tell if you look at the very bottom, at the base, where you can see it. It very much is clearly a tree trunk. Now here is the one that we have in our galleries. And it's very small, but you can see there, again, we have the tree trunk. So this is kind of a different example, but it's more obvious as far as showing you the tree trunk aspect. Just before we go on any further, I just want to give a little bit of information. In the slides that follow, for objects that are not held at the Art Institute, I have used an ID number from a website called Himalayan Art Resources, and it has a collection of a lot of different images of Himalayan art, and you can put in the ID number and pull up the image there, and many others. So I've talked about the portability of thangkas, but just because they can be moved doesn't necessarily mean they always are. They also have come to be placed in homes and shrines, monasteries, and even though there's no intention of moving them, the portable quality remains. Here we have them on the pillars in the prayer hall. And then there's another kind that is technically portable, but not portable in the sense of being more convenient for moving. There is a tradition of giant thangkas. These are thangkas that can be anywhere from the size of a building to the size of a large part of a mountain. These particular images show the Shoton Yogurt Festival at Drepung Monastery in central Tibet. As you can see, it takes a great many people to carry it out. So technically it's portable, but this is a different kind of definition of portable than something you could carry easily. And the size is just kind of magnificent here. The Shoton Festival has celebrations of the end of the retreat season and also of Tibetan opera and a variety of things. There are other monasteries that have giant thangkas as well. Here is one at a Tibetan nunnery in Kathmandu at Kopan Nunnery, and it's on the occasion of doing 100,000 offerings ceremony. This one is also a good image to show you to kind of move to our next topic, which is another unique kind of trait of thangkas, which is many times they come in sets. They are created a great portion of the time in sets, and these can be sets that represent members of a collection or different kinds of arrangements. The ones you can see there are what are called the 21 Taras. Tara is a Buddhist goddess, so this is a set of 21 that belongs to a particular teaching tradition. And here I'm again talking about some of the thangkas in the Art Institute's collection. This is a set of 7 thangkas that we have 7 of them, and this is what's interesting about sets is often they have a particular order that they should be displayed in. And you can tell because the composition actually expands beyond any single one of the thangkas. The middle thangka, the figure faces forward, but then all of the thangkas on the side, not in a very rigid way, but in kind of a fluid way, the figures in them face towards the center. So it's as if all of the figures on each side are facing towards the center. Here we go, just an example. So this is Bakula with his mongoose. And as you can see, he comes from the thangka, the second to the left, but he faces in towards the center. This set, it has a really interesting history and it ties in with Chicago. It was donated by someone that some of you may have heard of before, Emily Crane Chadburn. She was from a Chicago family and she grew up here. She moved to Paris and London in the 1920s, spent a decade or so there, traveled a bit, ended up moving to New York, but all the time she kept Chicago and the Art Institute in mind. And so when she was looking to give some of her art collection, she gave a great deal of it to Chicago. You might see her name in other areas of the museum. She also collected a lot of European art. But for our purposes, what we're interested in here is that she donated this collection of thangkas. And you can see from the number, 1923, she donated them really early, 1923. At that time, thangkas weren't really widely collected in art museums. We don't have any writing from her talking about what she felt when she got them, but she clearly cared for them a lot and somehow ended up giving them to the Art Institute. As you can see here, partially anyway, the curtain is intact, and this is true of all of them. Some with sharp eyes might note that there's some iconographic curiosity in this one that is still under research. The central figure is not who you'd expect it to be. But in any event, the whole set is just very beautifully preserved, which is actually really unusual. The curtains, they're made of very sort of gossamer, silky fabric, and they deteriorate over the decades and centuries. So we're very lucky to have them here. Now I'm going to move on and talk about not the thangkas as a physical object, but some of the paintings on it. this is one of the places where I'm giving kind of a tasting menu. We're not going to talk about anything kind of comprehensively, but hopefully you'll see some of the things that I have found interesting. I'm starting off with Shakyamuni and life story composition. So Shakyamuni is the historical Buddha. This is the figure who founded Buddhism in the 5th century BCE. Buddhism has a lot of traditions about what he did in his life. And so among them, and particularly popular in the Tibetan tradition, is a set of events that are kind of the progression from his conception all the way through his growing up as a prince, then renouncing the world, going on to meditate, realizing, becoming enlightened, going to teach and kind of create the Buddhist Sangha, and then finally dying after 4 decades of teaching. This subject is very popular in art, and sometimes it's depicted in sets of thangkas where you have a bunch of them. But then there's also sometimes where very ambitious designers have put all of the events in one composition. And so what I'm showing you here is 3 different interpretations or 3 different approaches to that. And I want you to take note, first of all, the thangka on the left is from Nepal in the 14th century. The one on the middle is from Tibet in the 19th century. And the one on the right is Sino-Tibetan, and we're still researching some of the information about it. There's painter marks that are in Tibetan based on our photography, so we'll be looking into that more. But basically, the different regions, different time periods. And so I want to start off with just talking about how the different thangkas are handling a particular event. Specifically, the very kind of important moment when the Buddha kind of fights off the forces of evil, of Mara's armies and his daughters, Mara being kind of a personification of death. Anyway, in the narrative, it's the thing that happens right before his enlightenment. And then, so in this one, you can see this is very regimented. It's everything, all the stories are put into little boxes and kept in kind of contained frames. Now for the second one, here you see a very different kind of image. It's based in a landscape, which the other one was not. And there are figures kind of arrayed around it, a little bit scattered in different spaces, but kind of floating and a little bit in more of a organic form. Finally, we have this last one, which has, it's a slightly different kind of set, but this one shows the demons and Mara's daughters, and the whole thing is enwrapped in flames and cloud, and it's increasingly organic, and you have kind of a different color palette too. So what the goal I want here is not for you to go away having memorized anything, but I want you to look at these 3, and I want you to kind of squint your eyes and kind of close them a little bit. And you can see the differences, right? There's, in terms of the very basic lines, there's a change, very distinctive change that happens in terms of the way of presenting these images. Now I'm going to talk about places and regions, kind of coming back to geography. As I was talking about before, starting with Western Tibet. Initially, when Buddhism entered Tibet, it entered central Tibet. And it was very closely tied with the Tibetan Empire, with the elites. And this was good initially, but then there was political fragmentation, and Buddhism lost a lot of its sort of institutional and centralized support. In Western Tibet, however, there was the formation of a kingdom and kind of a renewed interest and introduction of Buddhism after about 100 years. So first it enters in Tibet in like the 700s, 800s, and then things kind of fall apart in the 9th century. And then we have, once again in the 10th century, Buddhism coming back in the Western regions. This is kind of giving you an idea. This is the kind of central provinces of Tibet. And I'm talking about the region that is in the blue square right now. So this is, this region has a variety of different places, but I'm thinking of Gugge Kingdom, first of all. And in particular, there was a king there named Yeshe, and he helped reintroduce Buddhism back into Tibet. At this time, the area of Tibet, this Gugge region, if you go to the south, what is south is actually Kashmir. It's the western territories. So when Buddhism was coming up through this route, there was kind of an influence coming in terms of the styles from some of the Kashmiri painting, some of even going further west and further north, Gilgit, Afghanistan. And so here you can see just in the style of some of the figures, in the shading, kind of a similarity. Moving on to Central Tibet, the key thing I'm going to say about Central Tibet is it's complicated. You can see here, you notice that's where all the cities on this map are listed, yeah? And it's all in a fairly condensed region. So Central Tibet is the territory. It's running along the Sangpo River. And it's kind of the historical center, the core of where a lot of Tibetan civilization developed. It includes the Yarlung Valley, which is the location where some of the earliest Tibetan kings had their base. And it's an area that's very rich in kind of the mythology of the history. Anyway, suffice to say, there are many Tibetan polities and religious groups, different schools of Buddhism, different political factions. And so what I'm going to show you here is just kind of how wide the range is in what we get in Central Tibet. You have both kind of spanning 800 years of development. In addition, we have different Buddhist schools and different painting traditions. And then even aside from all of that, you have options. People are not required to paint exactly one style because that's the only style they know about. Artists can do different things. This, for example, is what's called a gold ground painting. And there's not an iconographic importance to the gold, but it is important in that it is showing great generosity from the sponsor. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to come back to this one, don't worry. And then here's just a very different example. Here you can see a lot more water and trees, landscape, kind of an asymmetrical arrangement, very bright colors. This is 19th century. And again, the thing I want to kind of just point out is there's a lot of scope for like difference and variation. Finally, Eastern Tibet, I'm going to talk about something that I haven't really talked about, which is it's not just kind of broad historical kind of trends. We do have some accounts of specific individuals who played an important role in shaping their tradition. And this is what we talk about by Eastern Tibet. Particularly, I want to talk about an individual named Situ Panchen Choki Chungne. Situ Panchen was, as his name indicates, a religious leader. He was an incarnate Lama or Tulku. He was also a writer. So we have some of his writings, both about religion and about art. And he was an artist himself and a designer. Many times, Thangka painting takes a whole bunch of stages. So you can have someone do the lines and draw the lines out, but then it'll be someone else who can fill in the colors. So he's involved that way. And finally, he was a patron, and he sponsored a lot of Thangka sets and different Thangkas that we actually have records of in his writings. This is his seat, Palpung Monastery in Eastern Tibet, and it became kind of the name Palpung style as the basis for a style that he kind of promulgated, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, and it's going to surprise you based on the things that we have seen so far. Is that different? Does that look different from what we looked at before? Yeah. It's a much paler colors, fine lines. There's landscape to a degree, but it's much more minimalistic. This is the central thangka of a set, another set like we talked about. But where the set I showed you before, that was 7 thangkas, this is a set of, I believe, 25 in total. And this thangka, I should say, by set, there's a particular design, and then many similar sets were made on the similar design. So maybe not the original exact thangka, but based on the same design. This is an Art Institute thangka that is from one of these sets that were designed by Situ Panchen. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because there's a story behind that, which will fall into our next section, which is the function of thangkas. And the first thing I'm going to talk about here is commemorating the dead. A significant amount of the time, thangkas are sponsored in memory or in commemoration of individuals who have died, whether it's one's teachers or someone one admires. This one we were just looking at, we know in quite a bit of detail. So Situ Panchen was very close friends with 2 other religious leaders at the time. They're called the Shamarpa and the Karmapa. And this is about 1732. The 2 of them were traveling, and they got smallpox, and they died very abruptly. And it affected Situ Panchen quite a lot, so he designed and sponsored this set of thangkas. Once again, going back to the thangkas that we looked at before, this is also from a set. This one, we don't know how many thangkas there are in the full set. There are 4 that survive. The one that we have is skull cup bearing Hevajra. Hevajra is a tantric meditational deity, all of the deities in this set are important to the particular school of Buddhism that they were created for. And they were created for a particular individual who died as well. This set was actually made for the occasion of the funeral, so they were to be presented at the funeral. Kind of moving on and talking about a different aspect. I kind of mentioned it already a little bit. So sponsoring thangkas is a form of merit making in the sense that it's an act of generosity. Buddhism has a lot of different practices, a lot of different ways of kind of engaging with the tradition. Some people become monks and nuns, but the vast majority of people are lay people, lay Buddhists. They can't go to a monastery. But there are things that Buddhism says, okay, but you're a lay person, but you can nonetheless practice these things. One of those is generosity, in particular supporting the community of monks and nuns. So sponsoring thangkas is one of the ways that is kind of done. I should say here, so thangkas, for the most part, were not created by monks in monasteries. Most of them were created by artists in artisan families that kind of existed for generations. And then customers would come and would commission a particular thangka. The memorial commissions, it might be some subject matter that the person felt strongly about. It might be something that it was recommended by a Buddhist teacher. But in any event, in most cases, the sponsoring of a thangka is the way that a person would create merit through engaging with Tibetan art. Finally, talking about the last section here, consecration, devotion, and ritual. When you see Thangkas in museums and even more in photographs if you look online, you often don't get to see the backside, which is really a shame because oftentimes there's really interesting stuff on the backside. Thangkas, when they are finished, they are consecrated. This means that they receive a kind of blessing that empowers them with the essence of the deity. And usually the most common way to do that is to have a Buddhist teacher come and bless them, and then syllables will be written on the back. There's more written here, but you can see Om, Ah, and Hum. And those are three Sanskrit syllables. They correspond to particular, the idea of the Buddha's body and speech and mind. And they're often put directly on the back side of where the image is. So if you see here, these three are right here in order to be directly behind this figure of Tara. This is showing the front and back. But it's not just that. If you look at the image on the left, the back side, there's not really enough detail here to zoom in, but if you see each of these little bits of writing all the same going around, that's because each of those consecration syllables are matched to the back side of all of the other figures on here. And not every Thangka has consecration syllables on it, but quite a few do. There's also an additional inscription here, and it's shaped in the shape of a stupa. These are often dedications. They can include prayers and mantras. They can include context information talking about who the Thangka was made for or the occasion. I should have just gone to that one. I forgot I had it. Yeah, anyway, so that shows you zoomed in a little bit. On the right side, we have the syllables Om, Ah, and Hum. There's also something else that happens. Even though you have the consecration that happens when it's first made, that's kind of not the end of it. You can also have additional consecration, additional blessings, particularly if an important Buddhist teacher comes. Sometimes they will consecrate or bless the Thangka by putting handprints on the back. So you can see here, this is the back side of this image on the right of White Tara. So then on the back, you have another stupa, and there is an inscription here. But then you also have these physical handprints. And this kind of confers an increased kind of additional blessing on the Thangka. And finally, one more example. Here again, we have the handprints. You have the Om, Ah, and Hum are very small in here, so a little harder to see. But this is the backside of the image on the right, Jetson Ningpo. Oops, sorry. So what does it do to have a Thangka be consecrated? One of the things it does is it creates what's called a worthy recipient. So this is kind of the idea that if one is going to practice generosity, donating, it's best to donate to someone or something that is a worthy recipient that will kind of bring the best results. The Buddhist concept, the story, image, I guess, metaphor that is used is sometimes planting a seed. So you have a seed of good intention, a seed of virtue, and you plant it in a field if it were farming. And if it were farming, the idea would be then you come back later and the field has grown and sprouted, hopefully. And if you think about the farming side, you want that field to be fertile. You want that field to be a good place to grow things. And so you talk about a field of merit, a good field of merit is something that will help you grow a lot of merit. And so having consecrations increases the efficacy of the Thangka as a devotional image. Finally, I'm going to talk about Thangkas in ritual practice, including mandalas, but not just limited to them. So mandalas are in one sense a diagram of a Buddha's palace shown from a bird's eye view, kind of a schematic drawing. And in Tibetan Buddhism, their general functions, they're used for rituals. And the actual mandala, the one that really matters, is visualized, is kind of not the physical one. However, you do have then the ones that we see, the representations of mandalas, which can be kind of, part of the recording of what it is supposed to look like. Here you have a painting that actually shows someone performing a mandala ritual. And you can see here the left side shows a zoomed-in passage, a zoomed-in portion of the image on the right side. And you can see the circle there. And there's different things placed around it. Those are other kinds of offerings and elements that are used in the ritual. They're just, in case it wasn't clear, that arrow kind of pointing from where the mandala is to the specific portion. And so mandalas, images, are used in particular for initiation rites, for empowerment rites. One of the concepts in Tibetan Buddhism is this idea of embodying a deity and kind of having the essence of a deity. And the idea being kind of that if you practice it, it'll get easier. It'll get easier to do it for real eventually. So it's kind of rehearsal. It's a learning process. And so a lot of rituals involve this process where you do a consecration. You invite the deity to come, and then you meditate upon, visualize the deity for the period of the ritual, and then dismiss them to leave afterwards. And that can involve meditation on an image in front or as oneself. You can also have multiple forms in which the deity is present. They can be in a image, they can be in a mandala, they can sometimes be in a water pot, they can be in the individual themselves. In funerary rituals, they can sometimes be in the deceased. So it's not mutually exclusive. But I also want to talk about something else that maybe doesn't get talked about so much, which is that you don't have to have a circle to have a mandala. Which is to say you can have the population of the deities in a mandala, because, like we said, the mandala overall is the circular or square or whatever one is a palace, but in each of the little quadrants you have different deities. So if you want to identify a mandala, the basic thing that makes a mandala a particular one is who is the central deity and how many surrounding deities are there. And why are there so many? Why are there different ones at all? It's because they come from different texts. There are a great many different traditions and different texts that have emerged, and they all have their own versions that kind of have developed and evolved. And so this can be mandala comes from a particular tantric text and teaches a particular practice which is done with the deities of that particular text. What I'm going to talk about here is when you don't see the circular form of the mandala, you might still be seeing the mandala. So this is the Medicine Buddha that the Art Institute has. And the Medicine Buddha does have mandalas. There's a variety of different ones. I've included a couple here. You can see in the image on the right, you can't see much detail, but you can see that he's blue in the middle. And so if we go back to this, how is that a mandala? I will show you. Okay, so here, Medicine Buddha, he's right in the middle. Now we have two bodhisattvas accompanying him, Suryaprabha and Chandraprabha. Then we have additional bodhisattvas in jewelry, Buddhas in monks' robes, yaksha generals, and they have a mongoose in their hand. They're kind of warriors. World protectors in Central Asian dress. And finally, Padmasambhava. And he's the only figure in this. He's human, and he's a founder of Buddhist teaching, Buddhist tradition in Tibet. So he's the only one that is not part of the mandala. All of the others, and guardians of the directions here on the sides. All of the others can be placed at different locations inside the mandala. I didn't fill in each one specifically, but as you can see, they could be arranged in various configurations. So that's how you can have a mandala, but actually what is being shown is not the form, just the population. Since we're on the subject of the medicine Buddha, I want to say one more thing about what we have in the gallery right now. This is, again, in the Portable Treasures of Mongolia exhibit. You can go look, and if you look closely, you will find, once again, the medicine Buddha. Here we go. And then the other thing I want to point out is I talked before about, you noticed how there were some of the Thangkas had more registers and more reds and blues, and then other ones had more landscapes and more blues and greens. So now that you've kind of looked at that a little bit, you can look here and you can see, yeah, there's actually landscape in the back there, yeah? So now when you go to look at it, you will have learned something about it. Now for my conclusion. I've been talking about Thangkas in a historical context, but Thangka painting is very much a living tradition today. And it is both kind of being practiced by traditional artists, by contemporary artists, and by artists who are kind of learning to preserve monastery heritage and that kind of thing. That's everything I wanted to talk to you about today. And we have a little time for questions.
So if you have any questions for Kris Anderson, you can raise your hand and a mic will come to you.
Kris, a question right here.
You mentioned the artist doing the Thangka is not necessarily numb, so the things in the, and then how does the sponsor reach the artist? How does that work?
I mean, I imagine it varies. The artist is part of the community, and so it is known that you can go and commission a Thangka from a particular artist. So the commissioner, the patron, the sponsor goes to the artist and requests
directly.
The Thangka.
Directly, because I noticed that you show a lot of older one. Maybe nowadays, just like an older commercial, but back then, like a long time ago, when the things first started, probably things not as commercial as today. How does the patron commission this artist, and who are the typical patron for the Thangka?
Well, I mean, not as commercial, but the patronage, the act of patronage is actually the commerce. It is the paying the cost of sponsoring the Thangka. The cost of paying for the Thangka, it pays for the materials, it pays for the artist's time, it pays for, supporting the artist's family because it's their full-time job. So that actually is built into the Buddhist kind of concept of generosity. You are sponsoring, you are doing an act, it's an act of merit to be sponsoring this Thangka. In the historical context that we have, we often know about sponsors. A person will sponsor it for their teacher or to honor their teacher. And so then it's, maybe given to someone, but the act of sponsorship is, commission.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated the way that you discussed how people make merit through Thangkas and the kind of the ritual functions of these Thangkas and these depictions of deities. But I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the aesthetic effect that some of these Thangka examples that you mentioned were supposed to have on their audience. I think specifically about the refuge field, the tree, or why, the effect of that tree motif of seeing, of placing oneself in this kind of family tree visually, and the kind of artistic importance of the detail in that. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of aesthetic quality?
I can try. Well, so, to kind of step back a little bit, the thing that makes is really kind of at the core of Buddhism, the thing that makes something Buddhist is that it was taught by a Buddha. And so what that means, or equivalent to being taught by a Buddha. But the end result of this is that lineage is really important. So kind of not just knowing who your teacher is, but understanding that your teacher had a teacher who had a teacher who had a teacher. And these things all can be traced all the way back to the Buddha, with like various levels of mythological like individuals in between. And so there is this idea that you are part of this kind of complete lineage. And I think the tree image, it would be a very kind of, I don't know, maybe inspiring particular way to look at it, because you're also, what are trees? They're living things, they're growing. So it's not just that you're kind of the end of something from the past, it's also something that is continuing to kind of blossom and, flourish and grow. So it's, I don't know, I guess it could be kind of empowering as far as feeling like, you're kind of the next part of the tradition. I don't know if that's the kind of answer that you would like, but that's what comes to mind.
Question on your far left.
Thank you for this very informative lecture. So I wonder if the Thangkas that you showed today, they are currently on display or they are in storage? Because having been here so many times, I feel like I haven't seen any Thangka. Like most Buddhist arts are either in the East Asian collection or in the this corridor over the track. And that's the Indian Buddhist art, and that's where you usually expect to see the Tibetan Thangka, but I didn't see any there. So I wonder, why they are not on display, and why they are not usually displayed in the Indian Buddhist collection, and also if it's on storage, whether there's a catalog that we consult. And the related question is the field museum. I've heard that there are a lot of Tibetan materials in field museum, which is strange because it's a natural history museum. So why send the Tibetan materials out there? So that's my two questions.
Okay, let me see if I can remember all of them in order. So we'll answer the middle one fastest because I remember. So catalog, the arctic.edu, the website. If you go into art and then you go into the collections, you can find some of the Tibetan works in there if you go into the Arts of Asia collection.
And that's in the Art Institute of Chicago website?
Yeah.
Or? Okay.
Yeah. And then the current exhibition, no, we don't have any up right now. And one of the reasons is because they're very, very sensitive to light. And so we can't have kind of the daylight getting to them. And so we have to wait until there's a rotation where we can display them and they won't be receiving any damage from light. So hopefully, keep your eyes open and we'll get some up in the coming future. As far as the, and then as far as the Field Museum, again, there's like a long history of how things were given to the museum. And especially kind of around the turn of the century, these Tibetan Thangkas tended to be given to ethnography collections. And so it's, the heritage of the museum is kind of how they all ended up everywhere that they are. Anyone else?
My question is kind of like in the current atmosphere, when you think about Tibet, you think about Mount Everest, but we don't see a lot of like kind of mountain art in that. Or, I mean, is there anything related to kind of what you're seeing in everything you showed today about Mount Everest? Well,
so actually, I mean, to a certain degree, that is kind of effect of the limitation of my time here. We do actually have Thangkas that show the mountains, and the mountains do play an important role in kind of being a place of retreat, a place of mountain deities. There's a lot of different things. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to show any additional Thangkas. But we do have one of Milarepa, and he is kind of shown in his mountain where he meditated. Yeah, so I'm sorry about that.
Kris, we have a question at the top center.
Oh.
Can you tell us why there's a curtain cover the Thangka? I think that's very important to know.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is because an image is considered ritually powerful and because you don't want to have it being shown either except for certain occasions or certain people. Remember how I talked about tantras are texts, and then from the texts come practices, and then you have traditions. Well, some of the texts have particular requirements that you should be taught by a specific teacher. You should be given permission. And so if you have been given permission to read that text, you are being given permission to practice that practice and permission to view that deity. So sometimes it is a ritual prescription that has to do with the texts and the traditions practices. Sometimes it is even on images that are not of that nature, there are still curtains, and that can help to protect them. And both, for when you're rolling them up and also when they're hanging, just having something in front can help a little bit. A lot of times thangkas become kind of darkened because in a traditional location in a monastery, there would be a lot of butter lamps, and the kind of smoke of the burning will kind of create a bit of a darkening. So I'm not sure if the curtain actually helps a lot with that, but it might help some.
So this will be our last question.
Hi. A few years ago, I heard a lecture by Dr. Sanderson, Alexis Sanderson, and he says that this Vajrayana Buddhism derives from Shaivism. So if that's true, is there a shared iconography that you would see? And I don't know, when I saw the Hey Vajra image, for example, the first thing
absolutely.
I thought of was, Natasha.
Yes, absolutely. So there is very good evidence in the texts of a particular phase of Buddhism and Shaivism. They were like kind of communicating back and forth. There are whole sections of Buddhist texts that have been pulled from Shaiva materials. There are ways where there have been like Buddhist interpretations that are kind of inspired or turned or whatever. So there's a very close connection. You can kind of think about it. I think it was a very what's the word? Like a fruitful, creative, religious ferment that was going on. So there were a lot of religious groups, Buddhist and Shaiva, who were kind of exploring what they could do, what their practices could attain, and they were, talking to each other. So there absolutely are like close connections, and I think Sanderson has shown in particular texts. And there's, more broadly speaking, like a lot of Buddhist iconography is coming because it's coming out of the Indian milieu, of course. And so, the things that were kind of in the air and around the Buddhists of the time, like India broadly, they brought those things into their tradition as well. So yes, absolutely.